You spent a couple of hours in the pub.
It was just like a normal night. Nothing different happened that night. And I remember when we left, it was just that usual, bye, speak to you tomorrow, or see you tomorrow. Lyn went her way with the boys. Then I got the bus to come home, and then the next morning I had my mum coming up to my bedroom to see if Lyn was with me. And I said, no, she didn't stay. Why? What's happened? And she said, oh, Lyn's mum's on the phone. Lyn didn't go home last night.
What had happened to Lyn?
She got attacked very brutally over her head. And then raped. And then when she was found, her pants were down her throat.
I didn't know that.
I remember going up to the hospital to see her, and Lyn was in a coma. That was the last time I saw her alive, until we got the news that she'd passed away. To lose your special friend, I've never had a special friend since. I'm sorry, I can't stop the tears now. Why Lyn? Did he mean to? Was it just a random attack? Did he know Lyn? Did I know Lyn? Did I know him? Did any of us know him?
Talking to Rosemary, the main thing that you feel is how more than 40 years after Lyn Weeden's death, she's carrying so much pain about the death of her best friend. I'd always thought of the Lyn Weeden attack as an anomaly, but then hearing that detail about the panties makes me think this was a sexual predator, perhaps of precisely the kind who killed Eve Stratford.
I see you are still having no luck catching me. You are no nearer catching me now than 4 years ago when I started.
The voice of the man the police believe is the Yorkshire Ripper, taunting them with their failure to catch him. The Ripper has butchered and mutilated 12 women. The Yorkshire Ripper doesn't know his victims. All he asks is that they are women and they are alone.
I think he will kill again, and possibly again and again.
Peter Sutcliffe, known as the Yorkshire Ripper, was one of Britain's most notorious serial killers. Between 1975 and 1981, he terrorised communities in the north of England, often carrying a hammer to attack lone women. As I looked into the murders of Eve Stratford and Lyn Weeden, I discovered that many people had come to wonder if Peter Sutcliffe was the killer. One ex-bunny girl had even contacted the police to tell them of her suspicions. It seemed an outlandish theory, but it turned out that it had been put forward by a former police intelligence officer in a book. I remember Peter Sutcliffe from my childhood as the Yorkshire Ripper. He was this terrifying figure who murdered women in the late 1970s, but in Yorkshire. So how can he possibly be connected to a series of murders that happened in London?
There were so many unsolved murders of unaccompanied women in the 1970s, and I condensed them, and I looked at Peter Sutcliffe, and he seemed to be the common denominator.
How many more murders do you think he ought to be considered in relation to?
My research has found 40. That
40?
includes, yes, that includes murders and attacks.
This is a shockingly high number, way more than the 13 murders and 7 attempted murders that Sutcliffe was found guilty of.
In the last 4 years, a succession of bodies have been brought into the mortuaries. 4 in Leeds, 3 in Bradford, 2 in Halifax, 2 in Manchester, 1 in Preston. And as the murders continued, the clamour to call in Scotland Yard also grew.
In 1975 is when Lyn Weeden is attacked.
Yeah.
And what is it about the attack on Lyn that bears the hallmarks of a Yorkshire Ripper attack?
The blunt force instrument to the back of the head, which smashed Lyn's skull, which Peter Sutcliffe used on a couple of occasions within the same timeline. Basically, in early August, Olive Smelt left a pub in Halifax. Sutcliffe followed her down a snicket and bashed her on the back of the head.
But the crucial thing is, Lyn Weeden was hundreds of miles south from where those prior attacks took place.
Well, Sonia, his future wife, had an older sister who lived in Alperton near Wembley. This was early September. Peter Sutcliffe and Sonia travelled down to Alperton. Eventually, they all flew off from Heathrow to go to Czechoslovakia and other Eastern European countries. This was the same week as Lyn's attack in West London.
Just to be clear, so you're saying that in the week of Lyn Weeden's death, the Yorkshire Ripper is in London 6 miles away from where Lyn Weeden is murdered?
Yes.
But what about the Eve Stratford murder? Do you think that Peter Sutcliffe is a plausible suspect for the murder of Eve?
Well, on the 22nd of March, Sonia's sister living in Alperton was getting married in the Wembley area. The family would have come down from Bradford in preparation and staying at the location because, you know, you're talking about 200 or 300 miles travel by road.
And 4 days earlier, Eve Stratford is murdered in Leighton. And in the MO of the Eve Stratford murder, which involved a rape and a knife attack that Eve had her throat cut, are those acts that could plausibly have been committed by Peter Sutcliffe?
In the acknowledged Yorkshire Ripper series, you have Emily Jackson and Irene Richardson both had their throats slashed, as well as other mutilation.
There's a link between Eve Stratford and Lyn Weeden that we know from the DNA that was gathered. Then presumably he would have been ruled out using his DNA.
This is a freedom of information request. I asked whether a sample of Peter Sutcliffe, also known as the Yorkshire Ripper, has been obtained and is searchable in the National DNA Database. And the Home Office came back and said a DNA sample for Peter Sutcliffe was obtained and is currently held and searchable in the National DNA Database. They did a buccal mouth swab, which they've done for all life prisoners, but Sutcliffe was a non-secretor. So although you leave a DNA sample with fingerprint or whatever because of the moisture, in a case of a non-secretor, although there's a barcode there, it doesn't actually go back to anyone unless you take blood from the suspect.
Sutcliffe was an evil predator, but blaming him for Lyn and Eve's murders somehow bothers me. It's too neat. Everything that seems to connect him to the crimes is pure supposition. Chris Clark claims that because Sutcliffe's blood type didn't show up in his semen or saliva, he can't be ruled out as the killer through DNA. But how true is this? I needed to talk to an expert. One of the reasons I wanted to get in touch was I was speaking to a former policeman. His argument is that as the Yorkshire Ripper was a non-secretor, there would have been no usable evidence to connect him to the crime scenes. Does it make any difference if the person is a secretor or a non-secretor in terms of getting DNA?
Absolutely no difference at all. It doesn't influence what we look at when we match somebody on a DNA profile. It's a completely different area of the DNA molecule that we're looking at. And whether somebody has the secretor gene or not isn't going to make any difference.
Professor Syndicum Court has helped me understand that being a non-secretor has no bearing on the quality of the DNA evidence. We know Peter Sutcliffe's DNA is on the national database, as is the DNA of Eve and Lyn's killer. If there was a match, the police computer would have made it. And since it wasn't Sutcliffe, who was it? I've come to question the apparent link between the murders of the ex-Bunny girl Eve Stratford and the West End croupier Linda Farrow. Despite certain similarities, there are key differences that suggest they were not killed by the same man. And yet Eve Stratford's murder was connected by DNA to another unsolved crime, the rape and murder of 16-year-old Lyn Weeden in 1975. And I was about to learn of another potential victim.
The 12:20 from Hammersmith pulled into Osterley tube station. Elizabeth Paravicini had been to see Casanova at a West End cinema with friends. She left the station alone. Elizabeth Paravicini was slim, blonde, and very attractive. She was half a mile from her parents' home, a walk that normally took her about 10 minutes. She set off along the Great West Road, a busy, well-lit dual carriageway. After 100 yards, she turned into leafy suburban Thornbury Road, into Church Road, and finally into Osterley Road, where her parents live. It was now nearly midnight. It was dark, and the roads were empty. She was a girl of impeccable background, walking through a respectable, middle-class part of town. She was alone, or so she thought.
This is the murder scene, the sad murder scene of Elizabeth Paravicini, and she was struck over the head with a blunt object, believed to be metallic, and it is thought that the suspect actually threw her over the wall to carry out his offences. And what happened is her dad, George, the next morning, retraced her steps, and it was in fact he that found his own daughter murdered.
Police have combed the shrubbery. The whole area has been searched and searched again. But still, 7 days after, no trace of the murder weapon or the murderer has been found. Police are intrigued by the fact that this murder was almost a carbon copy of another brutal murder which took place in the same area just 2 years ago. On September the 4th, 1975, a 16-year-old student, Lyn Weeden, was attacked and raped 50 yards from her home. And the two murders took place within a mile of each other.
What did you think of the investigation into the murder of Elizabeth Paravicini?
Chris Draycott, the Detective Chief Superintendent in charge of the quarry, actually linked the two. As a detective, I look at those two, it's virtually identical, the MO. They were both attacked from behind and both attacked with a blunt instrument.
Lyn Weeden was raped. Was Elizabeth Paravicini?
No, she wasn't raped. I think that was certainly the intention. I remember from looking through the case papers that it would appear that he had problems removing her lower clothing.
If Eve Stratford is DNA linked to Lyn Weeden, and the MO of Lyn Weeden and Elizabeth Paravicini is so similar, then we're looking at an individual who's responsible for all these murders.
Very much so, yes.
What sort of picture do you personally have of the murderer? What sort of person are you looking for?
To my mind, I'm looking for a brutal, callous killer who could well strike again.
Now, it was a particularly brutal attack, wasn't it?
It was.
Might he have been disturbed, do you think?
After the initial shock of seeing the links between these two unsolved murders, what strikes you about the case file?
I mean, when I picked it up, it was many, many years later, is to assess any possible lines of inquiry. So I decided that I was going to read all the witness depositions. And halfway through this huge bundle, as I found a statement from my best friend, who hitherto had been on the original inquiry.
So you're saying your friend was at the heart of both of the original investigations, gathering evidence?
Yeah, really the right person on the ground to be able to get a detailed overview as to what I had in front of me. My colleague, who had been a detective sergeant, revealed to me who he thought was responsible. This particular individual entered the police service in the 80s, was someone that I'd served with at a police station, and someone that I knew reasonably well. This was a serving Metropolitan Police officer.
Wow. That's a bombshell. We'll call this man Policeman B. How did his name come into the picture?
In the early 1980s, this man was convicted of serious indecent assault, sexually motivated burglaries and theft. So all of this were ringing serious alarm bells.
How far did this person live at the time from the sites of the Paravicini and Lyn Weeden murders?
Very close. He would have been able to walk to both sites within about half an hour from his home address.
Was he looked at in the original investigations of Lyn Weeden and Elizabeth Paravicini?
I can't recall him being a suspect.
The fellow we're talking about clearly left a bad impression on you and your former colleagues, but there's no evidence that suggests he's a murderer.
No. The trouble is, unless you've got some more compelling evidence, you've got nothing.
Policeman B had been routinely questioned in 1977 in relation to the murder of Elizabeth Paravicini and ruled out. Police at the time took the unusual step of publicly stating that he was never considered a suspect in this case or that of Lyn Weeden. They cleared him conclusively of any involvement in both cases. But my research into these murders showed that this man had been found guilty of a shocking but unrelated crime. It started with an investigation into a seemingly trivial theft, but revealed him to be a sexual predator. Simon Addy was the man who first arrested him.
In 1982, I was a detective sergeant at Brentford Police Station in charge of the small CID office there. The telephone rang, and it was a woman who said she was the headmistress of the Green School for Girls. At this school, the sixth form girls have a common room, and they all clubbed together and bought what was then a very expensive radio cassette player. And this had gone missing, and one of the girls told her later that a policeman had been seen leaving the school premises carrying a radio cassette player. She told me what his name was and that he was welcome on the premises because he was helping the girls with their skiing techniques. I decided I would have to go and knock on his door because there could be an innocent explanation, but, you know, being a detective, you always think the worst about people, so... I told him what the allegation was. He said, "It's my radio cassette player." So, go upstairs to his bedroom. He hands me the radio cassette player, and it is the same radio cassette player that was stolen from the Green School for Girls. So I arrested him, cautioned him, and then told him I would be searching his room. We first of all found a police radio, which at the time only covered police station area you would be in. As it turned out, he had taken this radio from Brentford Police Station, so it would cover Chiswick and Brentford area, the area in which he lived.
The PC we're talking about worked out of Kensington Police
Correct.
Station. What was your reaction when you were seeing
Well, I said,
these
why have you got this police radio here? And he said, I borrowed it. So we continued the search, and then, most interestingly, I found a police inspector's tunic with 2 pips on each shoulder.
Policeman B was only a constable. There was no reason for him to have the uniform of a senior officer. Well, why would anyone want to have a police inspector's uniform?
I did wonder whether he was putting this uniform on at night with the police radio, sort of prowling around, seeing who he could come across.
Whatever his motive for having these items, Policeman B had perpetrated terrible crimes. A young policeman who wore a black mask and brandished a terrible knife during a savage sex attack on a 34-year-old Hanworth housewife. The attacker put his arm around the woman's neck and held a 12-inch knife at her throat. He threatened to kill her, forced her to lie on the ground, removed her clothing, and indecently assaulted her. The woman, who broke down and wept as she gave evidence, said, "I kept saying, 'Please do not hurt me. Put the knife away and I'll do anything that you like.'" The victim of his crime worked in a West End nightclub, and that's how he came across her. He put her license plate into a police computer and used that to find her address. And he was also sneaking into the bedrooms of schoolgirls and stealing their underwear. And then he would subsequently call them up and terrorize them over the phone, telling them that he'd moved their underwear around. He got sentenced to 5.5 years in prison. That seems an astonishingly short sentence for such a serious crime. Today, the Metropolitan Police is reeling from a series of scandals that have destroyed the public's trust in it.
Sarah Everard was, the judge said, simply walking home.
Wayne Couzens, a policeman, also a kidnapper, rapist and murderer.
For the 2 decades David Carrick wore a police uniform, he was attacking and abusing women when he was off duty.
Policeman B's offending shows that the Met's problem with serving police officers carrying out sexual offences and preying on women is nothing new. A man who was supposed to protect the vulnerable was exploiting his position to abuse them. If there's one thing that's more terrifying than the idea of a predator, it's a predator in a policeman's uniform. I feel like I've taken this about as far as I can go on my own. I've still got so many unanswered questions that I think probably only the police are able to answer. So I'm going to write to the Met. I really want to know if these 4 murders are definitively linked by them, if they are investigating them together. I really want to know about the strength of the DNA link between Eve Stratford and Lyn Weeden, because so many aspects of the 2 crimes seem anomalous. As I was writing to the Met, my producer, Mel, finally tracked down the man who Gladys Hayes always suspected of being involved in her daughter Linda's murder. The man who I've called Policeman A was cleared in 1979, many years after leaving the force, of any involvement in the crime. Mel spoke to him on the phone, and he agreed we could use the recording.
You knew this Linda and Paul, you worked in casinos.
Let's go easy on the names. I'm a long way removed from that world. Basically, a lot of us are trying to make as much bloody money as we could before someone closed them all down. Oh, okay, there were a number of casinos that had contacts with the underworld. Ours was not.
And for the record, Linda and Paul weren't mixed up in any underworld stuff, if you like.
Not the 2 people I know. She would understand that if you push these bastards too far, they'd come back. No, that doesn't add up at all. If they were bloody good at hiding it.
Police have spoken to you before. Tell me a little bit about what's happened with that.
You've got away with awkward questions, girl. When the police first came to me, they mentioned Linda. I didn't realise at that stage that Linda was dead. It never made much news, as far as I remember.
And did they tell you why your name had cropped up, or was it a kind of blanket?
No. If they did, I can't remember it. I was certainly not very happy about it all. Because, one, I knew I had done nothing wrong. I knew I hadn't hurt anybody, I hadn't killed anybody, I hadn't robbed a bank, I'd done nothing wrong.
Policeman A said that Linda's death was as much of a mystery to him as it was to us. But then there was a development. This man revealed to Mel that the Met was sending 2 detectives to the Far East to speak to him.
All I know is they want to see me, they want to talk to me, I suppose. I've never killed anybody in my life. I've never even violently assaulted people. One or 2 of the rights I've done, but no, I didn't.
A couple of months later, Mel spoke to Policeman A again. He confirmed that detectives had been to his home, interviewed him, and taken his DNA and fingerprints. Policeman A told us that according to the detectives he'd spoken to, he is not a suspect in the murder of Linda Farrow, and he'd been cleared of any involvement in the case. I don't know why detectives went to talk to this man, but I did receive a response from the Met in which they confirmed that he'd been eliminated from their inquiries and divulged some other significant new information. I shared it with someone who'd helped me on my journey and had a lot of experience dealing with police bureaucracy. I sent you a copy of the letter I got from the Met. So the fact that they engaged with this to this extent is significant.
Yeah, because they're clearly recognising that what's being done has been serious and with a serious intent.
This is what the Met said in response to my questions. That Detective Chief Inspector Jeff Grogan of the Specialist Crime Command is leading the investigation into the murders of Eve Stratford in Leighton and Lyn Weeden in Hounslow in 1975. As this is a live investigation, it would be inappropriate to provide a running commentary, and the Met does not identify any person who may or may not be subject to an investigation. And I suppose that was what heartened me about the Met response, is that they say that this is a live investigation.
Yeah. Oh, that they're still actively considering leads, that they're still trying to trace, interview, and eliminate people who might be of interest to their investigation.
To date, how many DNA tests have now been done on the Weeden Stratford cases? To date, we have obtained more than 200 voluntary samples and work continues.
200 is a significant number. So that's the piece of new information that's in the public domain.
Then this was the kind of key one for me. I wanted to know if the murders of Linda Farrow, Eve Stratford, Lyn Weeden and Elizabeth Paravicini are linked. They say Lyn and Eve are linked. There is no evidence to link the murders of Eve and Lyn to any other historic murder case, but we retain an open mind. We are aware of reporting around Linda Farrow in particular, and while there are some similarities with Eve's case, there is no evidence to link them at this time. Instead of a single serial killer who was committing horrific crimes, it seems like there were multiple men capable of homicides against women.
And getting away with it. So that's 3 perpetrators that have frankly got away with it. And that for me was pretty depressing, but nonetheless real. What are you going to take away from what you've discovered?
Well, I never felt that I would solve it on my own, but I thought there were still enough people alive who might remember things, who might remember names, who might have key pieces of evidence, who might shine a light in a certain direction, that through that, I might scare up something that would move the story along. And I think that's still the case. I think this even going out, people watching it might scare up more information.
And that's a good ending, isn't it? If we shone a light onto a case that needed some attention.
As I came towards the end of my investigation, I got some sad news from Amsterdam. Eve Stratford's former boyfriend, Tony Priest, who'd been ill for a long time, had decided to end his own life with voluntary euthanasia. He never lived to see Eve's killer face justice. It's been a very sad journey, actually, and I think I embarked on it with kind of intellectual curiosity and a fascination for returning to the London of my childhood, and I was excited about the idea of solving a mystery that had lasted decades. But I've also encountered people whose lives have been irreparably damaged by grief and loss. When I think of Tony, or Rosemary, or Eve's fellow bunnies, you realise there are multiple tragedies, and the ripples from these murders go out for decades. So this is the grave of Eve Stratford, who died in 1975.